Hello and welcome to the Christ and Culture webcast. I'm your host, Taylor DeSoto. Today, as I promised at the end of 2018, we are going to be starting our series on text criticism for the layman. This is a topic that I have been studying for some time now, and I am by no means an expert, but I feel that I do have something to offer to this particular marketplace. There's a lot of people that are doing text criticism right now, or at least studying text criticism, that are very popular on YouTube and on their various podcasts, and a lot of the language is over people's heads, and oftentimes these videos are contained within really long, weighty podcasts, like 2-hour podcasts, and a lot of people don't have time for that. So I thought that maybe I could do 5 to 15 minute videos that could help people understand text criticism a little bit more. That being said, let's hop right into it. So what is text criticism? Well, it's a interesting question to define, and I'm not going to give you a textbook answer here. Let's give you a practical answer. Text criticism historically was the attempt to analyze manuscripts and get back to the original text, right? So if we can identify text families and maybe get a really old manuscript that we think is close to the original, we can get back to the original text. And you can actually do these exercises with a group of 20 people or so. You can copy a text, and you can see how the copying process works. And I've done this exercise with 7 people over 2 days, and you can actually get back to the original text. So that's the idea, historically. Now, interestingly enough, what happens in the 20th century is that text critics in academia and at the university level and these Bible societies, they realize that the search for the original is going to be impossible using their methodology. So the criteria that they've developed is not going to work to get back to the original. And so at some point, you can date it all the way back to 1908 or so. You have text critics saying, yeah, we can't get back to the original. Let's try to get, some people said, well, let's just abandon it altogether. Some people said, well, I think we can still get really close, and that's good enough. We can still, we can get the stuff, right? The substance of what the text said. We might be missing, snippets here or there. And that kind of progresses through the 20th century into where we are now, where the text critics that are putting together the Bible aren't trying to find the original anymore, but they are trying to find as close as you can get to the original. Now that's modern text criticism. There are different ideas and philosophies and theologies surrounding how text criticism should be done, how it's being done now, who's doing it, and we'll get into that as we progress through our series. But what you need to know is that modern text criticism is essentially taking a criteria that has been developed that they believe is good to determine what's the closest we can get based on what evidence we have. Now, why is that? Why we have, you've probably heard, we have thousands of manuscripts. How could we not get back to the original? Well, the problem is that the scientific methodology of it all is that we don't have the originals. They're lost in time, destroyed. They were originally written on organic material, water stems, the stems of a water plant, and so those don't age really well. And so using a scientific method, which requires you to actually have that original copy, you're going to find yourself running into some problems. And so that's partially why, because you can't know for certain. You can't know for certain that what you have is the original, because the earliest we've really got is 3rd century, and some of the best and most complete copies of the New Testament that we have are much later, and so that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have confidence that they are the original reading, but using a scientific method, you can't say 100% that they are the right reading. And so modern text criticism needs to adjust their definition from we're trying to find the original to we are now trying to find as close as we can get to the original. Now you've got basically varying opinions on this. There's kind of two sides to it. You have the traditional text advocates, which basically say, no, we absolutely, through God's preservation of his word, have the original, and it was collated in the 1500s during the Reformation. That's the original. We know that because God's preserved his word. Then you have the modern critical text position, which basically says, well, the originals did have the words of the writers of the New Testament, but we aren't quite sure if that's what we have now. But we think based on how much evidence we have something pretty dang close to it. Like I said, that's a practical definition of text criticism. You might have an alternative definition that you want to throw down for me, and maybe we can talk about that. I'm not saying my definition is perfect, but for all, for the person watching this video, that's a good enough explanation for you. So 2 common fallacies regarding text criticism. We're just going to do this sort of format as we go through it. We're going to give you some information, we're going to talk about some misconceptions, and then we're going to talk about what's called Erasmian myths. So 2 common fallacies regarding text criticism. The first one has to do with the Textus Receptus, which was first basically started being developed in 1516 by Desiderius Erasmus when it was published. And it was really the first time in church history that a collation, an eclectic collation had happened of Greek manuscripts and put together into a New Testament. And this was really important. This was a really important thing in church history because it really sparked and gave the reformers the ability to protest against Rome, through the translations that came about it, through the exposure to God's word that happened because of it. So the TR is really important in church history, regardless of whether or not you read, you side on the modern critical side or the traditional side. The TR is an important piece of church history. So a common fallacy regarding the TR is that you have, hundreds of TRs, and some of them were developed by back translating from English into Greek. This is commonly said about Scrivener's TR, his Textus Receptus, is that it was a back translation from the English KJV Bible into Greek. This is just wrong. It is just wrong. It does the same, basically the methodology that was employed to develop Scrivener's Textus Receptus is the same methodology that was done developing the first 25 editions of the Nestle-Aland Greek Testament. Basically, they collected previous versions of the TR and put them together, and they tried to do it in such a way that followed the readings of the King James, so that you had a harmony between your Greek text and your English text. He didn't back translate it from English. So while he did collect available collations of the Greek text and put them together into one Textus Receptus to follow the English reading, he didn't translate it from English. So those Greek readings already existed. They just got put together in one place with Scrivener's TR. So that's something really interesting. And so if you hear that, then perk your ear up a little bit and say, wait a minute, did you mean this? Because oftentimes it's not necessarily a malicious error. It's more so the way that it's phrased makes it sound like that Textus Receptus, that version of it, was a literal translation. They took the English KJV and said, all right, let's put this thing into Greek. And that's not what happened. The second misconception that you'll hear, and it really makes this conversation difficult as someone who is involved in the conversation, what makes this conversation really difficult is when, I've mentioned 2 groups before. You have the first group, which is the modern critical text. That's people who adhere to the Nestle-Aland 28th edition or previous, the United Bible Society 5th edition or previous, the texts that form your modern translations, ESV, NASB, etc., etc. And then you have the group they're called traditional text advocates, or confessional text advocates, they like to be called. They don't like to be called ecclesiastical text advocates, or because the whole title ecclesiastical text is a jab, right? It's an insult. And in that name, it's essentially saying, yeah, you guys just believe in that text because the church gave it, or agreed upon it, or gave it to you, or authorized it, or whatever. That's the argument that's used against the traditional or confessional text advocates. They call them ecclesiastical text advocates, kind of as a jab. So if you find yourself in a conversation with a traditional text person, avoid using ecclesiastical text because it's kind of insulting. But regarding this conversation between the two groups, right? Regarding this conversation, there's a really big problem in the discussion, and it actually hinders the discussion from actually happening. The problem is that oftentimes, because of a horrible group called KJV Onlyists, which is a really just not a solid position. Don't do that. Don't be. I mean, it's the same thing if you were to say, I'm going to be an ESV, 2001 onlyist, or I'm going to be an NIV from this particular year onlyist. Like, don't do that. And it's not the confessional position either. So, got my handy dandy confession here, and the Westminster reads very similarly. Chapter 1, paragraph 8 says, the Old Testament in Hebrew, which was the native language of the people of God of old, and the New Testament in Greek, which at the time of the writing of it was most generally known to the nations, being immediately inspired by God and by his singular care and providence, kept pure in all ages, and therefore authentic. So as in all controversies of religion, the church is finally to appeal to them. But because these original tongues are not known to all the people of God, who have a right unto an interest in the Scriptures, and are commanded in the fear of God to read and search them, therefore they are to be translated into vulgar language of every nation unto which they come. So there's the confessional position is that you cannot be a translation onlyist. Right, so if for example, back in Erasmus's time, if you were a Latin Vulgate onlyist, that's not a traditional, or that's not a confessional position. If you are a KJV onlyist, that is not a confessional position. All matters of debate, all matters of religious truth ought to be determined by the original languages. That is what the confession reads. So the traditional text advocates, there are many confessional, let's put it in front of the camera, confessional, reformed believers who are TR, Textus Receptus advocates. And what they're basically saying is that what we believe to be the original languages as framed in the confession is the Textus Receptus for the New Testament and the Masoretic text for the Old Testament. Whereas the modern critical guys will say, well, we believe that our critical edition of the Old Testament and our critical edition of the New Testament is the original language talked about. So that's the discussion, and it should be framed in that light. TR advocates are not KJV onlyists, though, and this is kind of the problem, many KJV onlyists end up defending the Textus Receptus because they have to. If you're going to defend an English translation, you're gonna eventually get to a conversation where you have to defend what it came from. So those two often get conflated. So if you hear TR only equals KJV onlyism, that person is intentionally conflating the two, probably because they've ran into an angry KJV onlyist at some point in their life, and for that, I've dealt with them. I'm in a couple KJV onlyist debate groups on Facebook. That's a big mistake, by the way. Don't do that to yourself. So I understand why they do that, but it's a fallacy. Not all TR advocates are KJV onlyists, and that needs to be noted. So if you're ever in a discussion where someone is clearly not advocating for one translation, period, that's God's word, et cetera, don't do that. So The two common fallacies are that certain versions of the TR were translated from English, and the second fallacy is that that TR advocates are KJV onlyists. Well, that has been it for this particular episode. I was going to get into an Erasmian myth, but to be faithful to what I said, stick these to 15 minutes so they're hopefully consumable by you guys. I'm going to cut it off here. So in review, I covered 3 things today. What is text criticism? It is the discipline or the science of trying to analyze the Greek manuscripts to collect or gather or put together a Greek New Testament that can be translated from, that can be trusted. That is modern text criticism. Now, at some point, we're going to talk about who's doing that. That's an important discussion, but that's generally what you talk about when it's text criticism. Analyzing the text and determining, does this belong, does that belong, etc., etc. The 2 fallacies that we covered today is that the TR was not translated from English. It was a collation. It was a collection. And then finally, TR advocates are not KJV onlyists. So with these 3 things that we covered, hopefully you start to develop an ear for when you hear some things in these conversations that might be maybe misinformed or perhaps just the product of being abused by KJV onlyists. Hopefully this is helpful. This has been Christ in Culture with your host, Taylor DeSoto. May the Lord bless you and keep you, and we will see you next time with Erasmian Myths.